This is not how agricultural dominance shifts. Most people think this is about railway infrastructure. Canada announcing $25 billion in railway investment for grain transportation and agricultural logistics. Technical specifications for rail capacity and grain terminal expansion, the kind of infrastructure project that fills transportation industry publications and gets analyzed by agricultural economists. But when Canada commits to building comprehensive railway networks that completely bypass American grain routes and processing facilities, that is not routine transportation development. That is the systematic elimination of American control over the agricultural supply chains that fed the world for generations. For 90 years, North American grain moved through American infrastructure. Canadian wheat transported through American railways to American ports. Prairie barley processed in American facilities before reaching global markets. The logistics existed. The grain elevators were positioned strategically. The profit-supported integrated agricultural systems, and everyone understood that North American food production was coordinated through American infrastructure that controlled how Canadian grain reached international buyers. Trump destroyed that integration in 54 months, not through agricultural policy or trade negotiations, but by treating Canadian grain exports like American strategic assets, where Canadian agricultural decisions were subordinate to American market priorities. First, with grain export restrictions during global food shortages that prioritized American domestic supplies over Canadian export commitments. Then, with transportation tariffs that increased costs for Canadian grain using American railways and port facilities. Then, with explicit demands that Canada limit grain exports to countries America considered strategic competitors. He assumed agricultural dependence meant permanent subordination. That American infrastructure advantages gave Washington permanent leverage over Canadian grain export decisions. That geography made alternative routes economically impossible. Instead, he gave Canada the strategic justification to do what agricultural economics had always made possible: build grain transportation systems that make American infrastructure access optional rather than mandatory. Mark Carney announced the National Agricultural Independence Railway Initiative in Regina, February 16, 2026. Not in Chicago, where grain trading protocols would require American market consultation, not through USMCA agricultural channels, where American grain interests could demand coordination oversight. In Saskatchewan, standing next to Canadian National Railway CEO Tracy Robinson, speaking directly to an audience that included executives from every major Canadian grain company and representatives from prairie farming cooperatives, spanning Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. The investment was unprecedented, 25 billion Canadian dollars over 10 years. The largest railway infrastructure project in Canadian history, focused specifically on grain transportation capacity that would operate independently of American railways, American grain elevators, and American port facilities, while providing comprehensive agricultural export capability that exceeds anything individual North American grain systems could handle. This is not theoretical transportation development. This is the construction of parallel agricultural supply chains designed to make American grain infrastructure irrelevant to Canadian agricultural exports within 8 years. Agricultural transportation represents the foundation of global food security and export competitiveness. Traditional grain exports depend on railway networks that can handle massive volumes during brief harvest windows when prairie grain production must reach global markets before seasonal weather makes transportation impossible. Canadian grain production feeds significant portions of global population. Prairie wheat supplies bread production across Asia and Africa. Canadian canola provides cooking oil for hundreds of millions of people. Barley and other grains support livestock production worldwide. The transportation systems that move Canadian grain from prairie farms to international markets determine global food prices and availability. The entity that controls Canadian grain transportation controls food supplies for hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Every grain shipment, every harvest movement, every agricultural export becomes either efficient or expensive depending on who controls the railways and port facilities that make Canadian grain accessible to global buyers. For decades, the United States maintained commanding control over Canadian grain exports through transportation infrastructure that Canadian agricultural producers needed to access international markets. American railways carried Canadian grain across the continent. American port facilities loaded Canadian wheat onto ships destined for global markets. American grain companies coordinated Canadian exports through integrated systems that generated profits for American infrastructure while serving Canadian agricultural production. That control is ending through Canadian transportation development that excludes American infrastructure participation. The National Railway Initiative brings together comprehensive agricultural transportation capabilities that collectively exceed American infrastructure capacity for handling Canadian grain. Canada contributes world-class railway engineering through companies that built transcontinental networks across challenging terrain. Canadian grain companies provide agricultural logistics expertise and prairie farming knowledge. Canadian port facilities offer direct ocean access that eliminates continental transportation requirements. Combined, Canada can create complete agricultural supply chains without depending on American railway networks, American grain elevators, or American port facilities. Every aspect of grain transportation from prairie farms to international shipping can be completed through Canadian infrastructure that operates independently of American agricultural coordination. The strategic implications are transformative. Canadian grain exported through Canadian infrastructure bypasses American transportation entirely. Agricultural products that previously generated revenue for American railways now move through Canadian systems. Grain exports that supported American port facilities now serve Canadian maritime infrastructure rather than American logistics networks. For the first time since prairie agriculture developed, Canadian grain will flow to international markets through transportation systems that operate completely independently of American infrastructure coordination. The initiative established 5 parallel development tracks that will fundamentally alter North American agricultural transportation within 8 years. First, high-capacity prairie railway networks connecting grain production areas directly to Canadian ports. Traditional grain transportation required multiple transfers through American facilities that added costs and delays to Canadian exports. Canada is building dedicated grain railways that connect prairie farming regions directly to Churchill, Vancouver, and Thunder Bay port facilities. These railways will include specialized grain cars, automated loading systems, and priority scheduling that moves Canadian grain from farms to ships without American infrastructure involvement. Direct prairie-to-port railways eliminate American transportation intermediaries while providing more reliable grain movement during critical harvest periods. Canadian grain reaches international buyers through supply chains that operate independently of American railway scheduling and capacity constraints. Second, expanded grain storage and processing facilities throughout the prairie provinces. Grain transportation requires storage capacity that can handle harvest volumes during brief seasonal windows when weather permits grain movement. The initiative includes massive grain elevator construction and expansion programs that increase Canadian storage capacity by 60%. These facilities will include advanced grain cleaning, quality control, and processing systems that add value to Canadian grain exports while reducing dependence on American processing facilities. Enhanced storage capacity enables Canadian grain to wait for optimal shipping conditions and market prices rather than forcing immediate movement through whatever transportation is available. Canadian grain companies gain market timing flexibility that increases export profitability. Third, comprehensive port infrastructure development for direct grain exports. Canadian grain historically used American ports because Canadian port facilities lacked capacity for handling large grain volumes during harvest seasons. Canada is investing $8 billion specifically in port expansion at Churchill, Vancouver, and Thunder Bay to handle increased grain volumes. These ports will include specialized grain loading equipment, expanded shipping berths, and weather-protected storage that enables year-round grain exports regardless of seasonal conditions. Port expansion eliminates American port dependency while providing Canadian grain companies direct access to international shipping routes. Canadian grain exports operate through Canadian infrastructure from farm to international delivery. Fourth, integrated grain marketing and logistics coordination systems. Grain exports require sophisticated coordination between farming, transportation, storage, and international shipping that traditionally operated through American agricultural companies with global marketing capabilities. The initiative includes Canadian grain marketing system development that coordinates prairie production with international buyers through Canadian companies that eliminate American agricultural intermediaries. These systems will include global market intelligence, international buyer relationships, and shipping coordination that serves Canadian grain exports exclusively. Marketing integration ensures Canadian grain reaches international buyers through Canadian coordination rather than depending on American agricultural companies that prioritized American market interests over Canadian export opportunities. Fifth, advanced agricultural technology and precision farming support systems. Grain transportation efficiency requires agricultural production that maximizes yield per hectare while optimizing grain quality for international market requirements. Canada is investing in agricultural technology development that increases prairie grain production through precision farming techniques, advanced crop varieties, and soil management systems specifically designed for Canadian climate and growing conditions. Technology advancement increases Canadian grain production volumes while improving quality standards that command premium prices in international markets. Enhanced agricultural productivity justifies massive transportation infrastructure investments through increased export revenues. The economic implications are staggering. American agricultural transportation generates approximately $15 billion annually from Canadian grain movement through American railways, grain elevators, and port facilities. Every Canadian grain shipment through Canadian infrastructure represents revenue that American transportation companies no longer collect. Canadian grain redirected through Canadian transportation creates immediate revenue losses for American railways that built business models around Canadian agricultural exports. American grain companies lose marketing commissions and processing fees from Canadian grain that bypasses American agricultural infrastructure. American port facilities face reduced grain volumes as Canadian exports shift to Canadian ports with expanded capacity and improved efficiency. American agricultural transportation employment declines as Canadian grain no longer requires American infrastructure services. The timeline is aggressive and achievable. Major railway construction begins immediately across Prairie provinces. Port expansion projects complete by 2029. Full grain transportation capacity becomes operational by 2032. Complete infrastructure integration achieves target volumes by 2034. Within 8 years, Canadian grain will move from prairie farms to international markets through transportation systems that handle current Canadian agricultural production without requiring American infrastructure participation. American agricultural transportation capabilities remain significant but increasingly irrelevant to Canadian grain exports. The United States maintains extensive railway networks and grain handling facilities, but Canadian grain will utilize Canadian infrastructure that provides superior service specifically designed for Canadian agricultural requirements. American transportation companies assumed Canadian grain would always require American infrastructure because Canadian systems lacked capacity for handling prairie agricultural production. When Canadian infrastructure matches American capacity while providing better service for Canadian agricultural exports, American transportation becomes optional rather than essential. American agricultural companies can provide transportation services, but they cannot force Canadian grain producers to use American infrastructure when Canadian systems offer better coordination and lower costs specifically optimized for Canadian agricultural exports. The initiative is attracting additional agricultural partnerships from countries that want grain supplies without American infrastructure intermediation. Brazil is exploring grain corridor agreements that could integrate with Canadian transportation systems. Argentina is considering agricultural partnerships that bypass American grain trading networks. Australia is developing agricultural cooperation agreements that provide diversified grain marketing through Canadian coordination. Each new partnership brings agricultural trade relationships that strengthen Canadian grain exports while reducing dependence on American agricultural infrastructure. What began as Canadian transportation development is becoming multilateral agricultural cooperation that collectively provides more comprehensive grain marketing than American infrastructure alone can offer. For American farmers, particularly in grain-producing states bordering Canada, the implications are economically devastating. American agricultural transportation infrastructure generated employment and revenue from Canadian grain movement. When Canadian grain bypasses American railways and ports, American agricultural communities lose economic activity that supported rural employment and regional development. American grain companies built business models around Canadian agricultural exports that provided steady revenue from transportation services, processing fees, and marketing commissions. When Canadian grain operates through Canadian infrastructure, American agricultural companies lose revenue streams that sustained profitability and employment. American port cities that specialized in grain exports face economic decline as Canadian grain shifts to Canadian ports with expanded capacity. American agricultural transportation employment disappears as Canadian infrastructure eliminates demand for American grain handling services. The transformation is already beginning. Major Canadian grain companies are redirecting export logistics toward Canadian transportation systems that offer improved service and reduced costs. American railways are reporting decreased Canadian grain volumes as Canadian infrastructure provides alternative transportation options. American grain facilities are experiencing reduced capacity utilization as Canadian agricultural exports shift to Canadian processing and storage systems. American agricultural infrastructure can still serve domestic grain production, but it cannot control Canadian grain transportation decisions that favor Canadian infrastructure, offering superior service specifically designed for Canadian agricultural requirements. The psychological impact on American agricultural industry leadership is evident in congressional testimony, where grain executives describe transportation volume losses they cannot address through infrastructure improvements or pricing competition. House Agriculture Committee members received briefings on Canadian grain redirection that clearly represents threats to American agricultural transportation, but offers no policy responses that would not damage broader trade relationships. Agricultural industry personnel acknowledged privately that American grain transportation advantages depended on Canadian agricultural exports that increasingly utilize Canadian infrastructure, designed specifically for Canadian grain production requirements. Transportation Department officials recognized that agricultural infrastructure influence erodes when Canadian grain operates beyond American transportation coordination. The precedent matters beyond agricultural transportation. If major agricultural producers can successfully develop transportation infrastructure that excludes American participation, other areas of supposed American infrastructure dominance become questionable. Energy transportation that bypasses American pipeline networks, mineral exports that utilize alternative shipping routes, manufacturing supply chains that operate independently of American logistics coordination. Each area where producers achieve transportation independence reduces American infrastructure leverage and influence. Trump wanted to demonstrate that Canadian agriculture needed American transportation infrastructure for international market access. Instead, he motivated Canada to develop agricultural transportation systems that make American infrastructure participation optional rather than essential. By the time Washington acknowledges the shift, Canadian grain will already move through Canadian transportation systems that provide superior service for Canadian agricultural exports. Agricultural supply chains will already operate beyond American infrastructure oversight. Canadian grain exports will already function independently of American transportation coordination that prioritized American infrastructure interests over Canadian agricultural requirements. History does not reverse because it is misunderstood. Agricultural transportation dominance is shifting from American infrastructure control toward Canadian systems designed specifically for Canadian grain production requirements. Food supply chains are restructuring around Canadian transportation networks that operate beyond traditional American infrastructure oversight. Agricultural export control is distributing toward producers who choose transportation efficiency over infrastructure subordination and discover they can achieve more through Canadian coordination than American transportation systems that never prioritized Canadian agricultural success over American infrastructure profitability.